It was one of those mornings at Buckingham Palace where everything looked perfect on the outside. The flags were straight. The guards stood like statues carved from stone. The sky over London had decided, for once, to cooperate pale blue, a few white clouds drifting slowly past like they had somewhere to be but were in no particular hurry. The kind of morning that makes you think everything is exactly as it should be. But, inside the palace walls, beneath all that polish and ceremony, things were never quite as simple as they appeared from the outside. Princess Charlotte was 7 years old on this particular day, and, like most 7-year-olds, she had no interest in standing still. She had inherited her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and, on this morning she was wearing a pale blue dress with white shoes that had already collected a smudge of something unidentifiable near the left toe. Her dark hair was combed back and held with a clip, though 2 small strands had already escaped and were doing their own thing near her temples. She stood in one of the grand hallways of the palace, the kind of hallway that makes ordinary people walk slower just from the weight of history pressing down through the ceiling, and she was looking at a painting on the wall with the intense focus that only children and art critics can manage. The painting was enormous. It showed a man on a horse. Charlotte had decided she did not like the horse's expression and was currently attempting to communicate this opinion to nobody in particular, because nobody in particular was standing close enough to hear her. Her protection officer was close, but not hovering. That was always the balance with Charlotte. She needed room. She pushed back against closeness in that particular way that small people with large personalities tend to do. Give her space and she would behave herself perfectly well. Crowd her and she would find creative ways to make everyone's afternoon more complicated. The morning had a schedule, as all mornings in that palace did. There was a luncheon later. Before that, there was a smaller gathering, a family occasion, informal by royal standards, which still meant it was more formal than most weddings outside those walls. Members of the extended family were moving through the palace in that particular way they moved, with purpose, with awareness of where the cameras might be, with the practiced ease of people who had grown up knowing that how you walked into a room said something about who you were. Camilla was there. This requires a small pause, because context matters. By this point in the story of the British royal family, Camilla had been queen consort and, then, queen. She had traveled a long road to get to where she stood, a road that was not always smooth, that had sharp edges and difficult years and a public that had, for a long time, looked at her with something between suspicion and outright hostility. She had learned to carry herself through all of that. She had learned to keep her face neutral when it needed to be, to smile at the right moments, to stand in rooms where the emotional temperature was complicated and give nothing away. She was gracious. She was practiced. She knew the rules. But, here is the thing about rules in royal settings, they are not always written down anywhere. Some of them live only in the understanding of the people who have spent years inside those environments. Some of them exist only in the eyes of the protection officers who watch everything and say very little. Camilla moved through the hallway with the kind of ease that comes from long familiarity. She knew this palace the way some people know a childhood home, not every room, but the feeling of the air in certain corridors, the way sound traveled differently near the east wing, the places where the light came through at a particular angle in the morning. She had been in these spaces for years now. She belonged here in the official sense. Her name was on the right documents. Her portrait was being painted. Her place in the institution was fixed. She saw Charlotte standing by the painting. There was something in the way she moved then, a slight shift in direction, a small adjustment of trajectory, the kind of thing that a person does without fully thinking about it when they see a child they know. Natural. Instinctive. The kind of movement that in any other family, in any other hallway, would have been completely unremarkable. She began to move toward Charlotte. The protection officer saw it. He was not a tall man, but he was built in the way that people who do that job for long enough tend to get built, solid, contained, with the kind of stillness that is not laziness but its opposite. He had been standing 3 meters from Charlotte, positioned at the angle that gave him a clear line of sight to every entrance point in that section of the hallway. His eyes moved constantly in the way that trained eyes do, not dramatically, not in the scanning robot manner of movie bodyguards, but in the quiet, systematic way of someone who has made a profession of noticing. He noticed. And he stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not with any kind of confrontational energy. He simply moved his body into a position between where Camilla was and where Charlotte stood, and he did it in a single smooth motion that might have looked, to a casual observer, like he was simply adjusting his stance. Shifting his weight. Nothing to see here. But it was not nothing. The message was clear to anyone who understood the language being spoken, and Camilla understood it immediately, because she had spent enough time around protection officers to read their body language the way ordinary people read facial expressions. She stopped. She recalibrated. She shifted her own direction slightly, her face showing nothing, her posture unchanged, and she continued along the hallway as though that had been her intention all along. Charlotte, still focused on the horse's unfriendly expression in the painting, noticed none of this. The entire thing lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds that contained a great deal. To understand what those 4 seconds meant, you have to understand something about the British royal family that is difficult to explain to people who have not spent time thinking about it. On the surface, it is an institution. It has a website and a press office and official engagements and a calendar that runs years in advance. It produces photographs and statements and appears at events in the correct order with the correct spacing between individuals. It functions, from the outside, like a very well-organized enterprise. But underneath that, it is a family. And families carry things that no official statement ever acknowledges. They carry histories. They carry old hurts. They carry the particular weight of things that happened before some members of the family were even born, things that became part of the air inside certain rooms, things that children absorb without being told anything directly. Charlotte had not been told anything directly. She was 7. She knew that she had a grandmother named Catherine who was her mother and not a grandmother at all, and she knew she had a father who was Prince William, and she knew she had a grandfather who was now king. She knew the shapes of her family the way children know shapes, not with analysis, but with the body, with instinct, with the particular radar that children have for emotional weather even when the adults around them are doing everything possible to keep the sky looking clear. Camilla was not her grandmother. Not in the way that mattered to a 7-year-old girl. The protection officer knew this. His job was not only to watch for external threats. His job was to understand the environment in which his principal existed, to read the room, to anticipate not only physical danger, but the subtler kinds of discomfort that could make a child feel unsafe or overwhelmed or simply strange. He had been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes the most important thing you could do is to stand between a child and a situation that the child had no tools yet to navigate. He had not been given an instruction. No one had pulled him aside that morning and said, if Camilla moves toward Charlotte, step in. Nothing like that had been said, because nothing like that needed to be said. The understanding lived in the fabric of the assignment itself. He had stepped in because he understood what his job actually was. The hallway continued its morning. Somewhere deeper in the palace, a door opened and closed. The sound of shoes on the marble floor came and went. One of the footmen appeared at the far end of the corridor and, then, disappeared again through another door. The painting with the unhappy horse continued to hang on the wall. Charlotte finally turned away from the painting. She had reached some private conclusion about it, her expression suggested the verdict was not favorable, and she looked up at her protection officer with the directness that she had always shown, that complete absence of social performance that small children have before the world teaches them to manage their faces. The horse looks annoyed, she said. He does a bit, the officer said. Do you think he was annoyed when they painted him? Hard to say. Could have been a long sitting. Charlotte considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then, she decided it was time to go somewhere else and began walking in the direction of the next room, and her protection officer moved with her at the correct distance, close enough, not too close, and the morning continued. Camilla had long since turned the corner at the end of the hallway. The 4 seconds had passed. The moment had closed behind itself like water. Nothing had happened, officially. There was no incident. There would be no report filed that described what had occurred in that hallway, because what had occurred was too subtle to reduce to the language of incident reports. It was a protection officer doing his job with the kind of intelligence that goes beyond physical response, and it was the particular complexity of one of the world's most scrutinized families quietly managing the things that never make it into official photographs. And Charlotte, walking with her characteristic purposefulness toward whatever she had decided to look at next, carried none of it. That was the point. That had always been the point. The people around Charlotte, the officers, the staff, the careful architecture of protection that surrounded royal children existed precisely so that Charlotte could be 7 years old. So that she could have opinions about horse paintings. So that she could walk through the grand corridors of that palace without carrying the weight of everything that had happened in those corridors before she was born. She was a child. She was meant to be a child. The morning at the palace moved forward. The luncheon was still an hour away. In the kitchens, things were being prepared with the kind of precision that royal events require. In the various reception rooms, staff made small adjustments, a chair moved 2 inches to the left, a floral arrangement reconsidered and, then, restored to its original position, a window checked and, then, checked again. The machinery of the palace went about its business. And, in the hallway with the horse painting, nothing had happened. Nothing at all. Except that a protection officer had taken one step forward at exactly the right moment, and a small girl had kept her mourning intact, and the thousand unspoken things that live inside a complicated family had been held back for a few more hours by the simple, unremarkable, quietly extraordinary competence of a man whose job was to see what was coming before it arrived. The flags over the palace were still straight. The sky was still pale blue. The clouds were still drifting with their unhurried sense of purpose. Everything looked exactly as it should. There is a particular kind of silence that exists in large houses after something has almost happened. Not the silence of peace, nothing as comfortable as that. It is the silence of held breath, the kind that settles into walls and furniture and the very air of a room, the kind that people who work in such houses learn to read the way farmers read weather. It is not a dramatic silence. It does not announce itself. It simply sits there, occupying space, giving off a particular quality of stillness that trained people recognize without being able to fully explain. The palace had that silence in the hour that followed. Not everywhere. In the kitchens, there was noise, the organized, purposeful noise of preparation, pots and conversations and the efficient movement of people with specific tasks. In the press office somewhere in the building, phones were being answered and statements were being reviewed and the daily management of the family's public image was proceeding on schedule. In the guardhouse at the front gate, the changing of the guard was approaching with its own elaborate choreography, the kind of ceremony that tourists queued on the pavement outside to photograph and that the guards themselves performed with the blank-faced professionalism of people who have done something 10,000 times and have metabolized it completely. But, in the East Wing, in the particular corridor where a protection officer had taken one quiet step forward approximately 40 minutes ago, the silence had a different texture. The officer, his name was James Whitmore, though this is not a detail that will appear in any newspaper, had repositioned himself near the entrance to the morning sitting room where Charlotte had eventually settled. She was inside with a book and a glass of juice and what appeared to be a very serious internal debate about which page she wanted to read next. He could see her through the partially open door. She was fine. She was doing what children do when left to their own devices in rooms full of interesting things. She was existing fully in her own world, sealed inside it the way children are when they're truly occupied, impervious to the adult atmosphere pressing against the walls outside. Whitmore was not fine, exactly. He was professional, which is different. He was running the moment back through his mind. Not with anxiety, that was not how he had learned to process things, but with the measured, analytical attention that his training had made habitual. He was checking his own work. Had he read the situation correctly? Had his intervention been proportionate? Had he stepped in at the right moment or had he been early? Had he been reactive to something that would have resolved itself naturally? Had he, and this was always the most uncomfortable question, overstepped? His job had given him a particular relationship with these questions. You could not do what he did without developing a very precise internal calibration, a sense of when action was required and when it was not, and the calibration was never static, it updated constantly, fed by new information, by the particular dynamics of a given day, by the people involved and their histories and the 100 small variables that no protocol document ever quite managed to capture. The protocol was the skeleton. The judgment was the living thing built on top of it. He had done his job. He was almost certain he had done it correctly. Almost. Down the corridor, things were beginning to prepare themselves for the luncheon. A pair of household staff moved past with the practiced invisibility of people who have learned to be in spaces without intruding on them. They walked at the right pace, kept their eyes directed at their tasks rather than at the doors they passed, and disappeared around a corner without any fuss. The palace managed this well. It always had. The machinery of royal life was built partly on the extraordinary ability of certain people to be present without being seen. Whitmore watched them pass and returned his attention to the door. Charlotte had put down the book and picked it up again. She was apparently reconsidering her position on whichever page had been causing the difficulty. Her juice was 3/4 gone. He thought about Camilla. He did not think about her unkindly. This is important. His intervention had not come from hostility or from any personal judgment about who she was or what her intentions had been. His read of the situation had been clinical, as it needed to be, not who is this person, but what is this dynamic, and what does my principal need in this moment, and is this a moment that requires something from me? The answers had come quickly, the way they always did when the training had time to settle into instinct. He had moved. He would make the same decision again in the same circumstances. But he thought about her. Because here was the complication that protocol did not address. Camilla had done nothing wrong. She had seen a child and moved toward her in the natural way that adults move toward children they know. She had not been aggressive. She had not been intrusive. She had simply been a woman in a hallway who had shifted her trajectory slightly when she spotted a small girl standing alone looking at a painting. From the outside, it was harmless. It was ordinary. And, yet, the protection officer's job was not to manage the outside. It was to manage the inside, the particular emotional and psychological environment in which his principal existed, the invisible architecture of that child's world. And, in that invisible architecture, certain relationships had shapes that were not simple. That was not a moral judgment. It was a fact, the way facts about weather are facts. You don't judge the weather. You dress appropriately for it. He had dressed appropriately for it. The luncheon was in 35 minutes. He would need to move Charlotte in 20, give her time to settle, to be handed over to her parents in the natural way that happened at these events, not formally, not with any announcement, just the quiet transition of a child moving from one trusted adult orbit to another. Charlotte handled transitions well when they were managed smoothly. She resisted them when they were handled with any kind of ceremony, because ceremony made her feel like a piece of furniture being carried from one room to another, and she had always, even at 3, 4, 5 years old, had a very clear sense of when she was being arranged rather than accompanied. She was a perceptive child. This was not always comfortable for the people around her, but it was true, and the people who knew her well had learned to work with it rather than around it. Whitmore moved slightly down the corridor and checked his phone. Nothing urgent. He replaced it. Inside the sitting room, Charlotte had apparently resolved her page dispute. She was reading now with the full-body focus that children bring to books that have captured them, slightly hunched, her juice forgotten, the room around her faded out. Whatever world she had entered in those pages had claimed her completely. He gave her the time. In the room on the other side of the corridor, a receiving room that was being arranged for the pre-luncheon gathering, the staff were finishing their preparations. He could hear the small sounds of it, a chair leg on marble, the soft sound of something fabric being adjusted, the muffled exchange of two voices confirming something about a seating arrangement. These were the sounds of the institution functioning. Reliable sounds. The kind that, after enough years in this environment, became almost like background music, present enough to register if they changed, quiet enough not to demand attention. And, then, there was a different sound. Footsteps in the corridor, coming from the direction of the main staircase. Not the quiet footsteps of household staff. These were different, the particular rhythm of someone who moved through these spaces with authority, with the ease of ownership. Whitmore positioned himself smoothly, the adjustment so small it would register as nothing to a casual observer, but giving him better sightlines to the corridor approach. It was Prince William. He came around the corner with the particular combination of warmth and reserve that was his public register in these semi-private settings, not the full formal version, the one that appeared in press photographs, but not fully relaxed either. Somewhere in between, which was where most of his family seemed to live when the palace walls were around them. He was wearing a dark jacket, no tie, which meant the luncheon was genuinely informal by the standards of the place rather than institutional informal, which meant something different entirely. He glanced at Whitmore, and there was a small exchange in that glance, the kind of communication that does not use words, that exists between a principal and a protection officer who have been working together long enough to develop a shorthand. Whitmore gave a small signal. "Everything is fine. She's in the sitting room. No issues." William gave an equally small nod, then pushed the door to the sitting room open with the casual ease of a father who has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. "What are you reading?" Charlotte looked up from her book with the expression of someone who has been pulled slightly reluctantly from a better world. She assessed her father for a moment, that same evaluating look she had turned on the horse painting earlier, and apparently decided he was acceptable company. "It's about animals," she said. "There's a parrot." "Good parrot or bad parrot?" "He doesn't know yet. He just arrived." "Sounds promising." She returned to the book with the air of someone who has given as much of their time to adult conversation as they can reasonably afford. William sat down in the chair on the other side of the small table, the one with the clear view of the door, and reached for a magazine that had been sitting on the side table. He opened it to a random page. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, father and daughter in adjacent worlds. Whitmore remained in the corridor. He thought about the morning. About the 4 seconds in the hallway. About the intervention that had not been noticed by the person it was designed to protect, which was exactly as it should be. About the woman who had understood the message in his body language and adjusted her course without any fuss, which was also exactly as it should be, and which he found himself quietly grateful for. Things could have been harder. They sometimes were. The fact that they had not been harder this morning was not nothing. He thought about the particular weight of working in this environment, where so much of what was important was unspoken, where so much of the real work happened in the margins between official moments, where the job was never quite finished because the dynamics never quite resolved, they just changed shape and required new reading, new calibration, new small adjustments made with the precision of a watchmaker working in low light. He was good at this job. He knew that without arrogance, because knowing it without arrogance was part of what made him good at it. People who were arrogant about this work got things wrong. They started to perform the job rather than do it. They started to make themselves visible when visibility was precisely what you were supposed to avoid. He had been invisible this morning. Charlotte had not known he was there in any meaningful sense. She never did, in the best version of the days when everything went right. She moved through her world and he moved alongside her world, and the two things intersected only when they needed to, and when they needed to it was usually because something was happening that she was not yet equipped to handle. She was 7. He thought about what it meant to be 7 in that family, in that building, surrounded by all of that history and all of those cameras and all of those unspoken things that the adults around you managed on your behalf so that you could stay 7 for as long as possible. There was something both beautiful and heavy about it. The protection was real. The care was real. And the world that care was protecting her from was also real, and one day she would have to learn to navigate it herself, and the job of everyone around her right now was to make sure she arrived at that day with enough of herself intact to do it. He hoped they were doing that. He believed they were doing that. Inside the sitting room, the parrot had apparently made progress in either direction, because Charlotte gave a small sound, not quite a laugh, but its precursor. The intake of breath that means something has happened on the page that the reader was hoping for or dreading, one of those two things. William looked over at her. She did not look up from the book. But the corner of her mouth had moved. Whitmore allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. The luncheon was in 23 minutes. In a few moments he would need to signal the transition. Charlotte would protest she would not go without registering that the parrot's situation remained unresolved, that she was being pulled away at a moment of narrative tension, that the timing was, in her considered opinion, poor. This would last approximately 90 seconds. Then, she would put the book down precisely where she had been reading, and she would straighten herself in that particular way she had, the one that was not quite queenly but was adjacent to it, and she would walk out of the room with her father in the correct direction. She always did. She was, beneath the opinions about horse paintings and the deep investment in parrots whose moral alignment remained unclear, an extremely well-composed child. The corridor around Whitmore was quiet again. The staff had finished in the receiving room. The sounds of preparation had settled into the particular stillness of a room that is ready. He checked his watch. 22 minutes. The luncheon happened the way luncheons in that building always happened, with the kind of precision that looks effortless only because an enormous amount of effort has been spent in advance making it look that way. The tablecloths were wrong once and, then, they were right. The flowers had been argued over in the morning and, the argument had been settled in favor of cream over white, which was a distinction that sounded invented but, apparently was not. The seating arrangement had gone through 4 versions before arriving at something that satisfied the requirements of protocol, family comfort, and the particular geometry of who could and could not be placed too close to whom without creating an atmosphere. These calculations were made, as they always were, by people who never appeared in the photographs. Charlotte arrived at the luncheon in the way she always arrived at things, slightly ahead of whatever pace the event seemed to want, walking with that particular combination of dignity and impatience that was becoming more her own with every year. She had changed out of the blue dress with the smudged shoe into something different, pale green this time, and her hair had been redone with more success than the morning attempt, and she looked, to anyone watching, like a small person who had been dressed carefully and was tolerating it with grace. She sat where she was meant to sit. She used the correct fork. She answered questions when questions were directed at her, and the answers she gave were polite and brief and gave very little away, which was something she had absorbed by proximity rather than instruction, the particular royal gift of answering questions completely while somehow revealing nothing. Whitmore was not at the table. He was never at the table. He was positioned where he needed to be, in the place that gave him the sightlines he required while placing him outside the frame of anything that felt like an occasion. This was the geometry of his work, always present, never in the picture. Camilla was at the table. She was several seats away from Charlotte, which was not an accident, and she was talking to the person on her left with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to be comfortable in rooms where comfort required constant, invisible work. She laughed at something. She touched her wine glass without lifting it. She was charming, contained, entirely in possession of herself, and she had not looked in Charlotte's direction once since sitting down. This was also not an accident. But, here is the thing that was quietly true, the thing that would not appear in any account of that day: there was nothing hostile in what she was doing. Camilla was not avoiding Charlotte out of anger or resentment or any of the darker emotions that the public sometimes attach to the complicated spaces inside that family. She was doing what intelligent, perceptive people do when they understand a situation: she was giving it room. She was standing back. She was letting the air be the air without pressing on it. She had understood, from the moment that the protection officer had stepped forward in the hallway, what the message was. Not that she was unwelcome. Not that she was a threat. But that the morning had a particular equilibrium, and the equilibrium needed to be maintained, and her role in maintaining it was to move in a different direction. She had done that without drama, without resentment, without any of the wounded performance that a smaller person might have reached for in that moment. She had simply adjusted. This was, in its own way, a kind of grace. It did not make everything simple. It did not resolve the things that were not resolved. But it was grace nonetheless. Charlotte ate her lunch. She was given a choice of 2 desserts and she spent a meaningful amount of time considering both before selecting one, and then immediately reconsidering, and then sticking with her original choice with the air of someone who has made a decision and will live by it even if they have doubts. She ate it with the slightly too fast pace that children bring to things they genuinely enjoy. Across the table, William watched this and said nothing, but the expression on his face had in it everything that was not being said. Outside the windows of the dining room, the London afternoon had settled into its typical February temperament: grey, resolute, giving nothing away. The trees in the garden stood with the stripped patience of things that know the cold is temporary and have simply decided to wait it out. A pigeon landed on the stone balustrade outside and stood there with the particular confidence of urban birds that have understood they are operating in a space where no one is going to bother them. Inside, the luncheon moved through its stages. After the meal, there was the informal portion, the period that was still structured but wore its structure loosely, the part where people moved between small groups and the conversations became quieter and more genuine and the whole thing relaxed from a ceremony into something approaching a gathering. Charlotte was given permission to leave the table and she took it without ceremony, appearing moments later in the garden doorway in her shoes, which were going to add a second smudge to the collection if the current trajectory held. Whitmore repositioned. The garden was manageable, contained, walled, the entry points known and controlled. He let Charlotte have the space she was moving into and tracked her without crowding her, which was the only way to track Charlotte. She went directly to the pigeon on the balustrade with the specific interest of a child who has spotted something worth investigating, and the pigeon, displaying either remarkable composure or remarkable stupidity, held its ground for approximately 4 seconds before reconsidering and departing for a nearby tree. Charlotte watched it go with what appeared to be respect. She walked along the path that ran beside the garden wall, looking at things, touching the occasional stone, being fully and completely 7 years old in the February afternoon. The cold did not seem to bother her. She was carrying a slight flush in her cheeks from the warmth of the dining room that would fade in a few minutes, and she looked, in that particular light, so unremarkably like a child that it was almost easy to forget where she was and who she was and what the particular weight of her name meant in the world. Almost. Inside, through the glass of the garden doors, the luncheon was concluding its informal phase. People were beginning the slow, polite movement toward departure that signals the end of these things, the conversations getting slightly shorter, the glances toward watches or phones becoming slightly more frequent, the particular choreography of leave-taking in formal settings that has its own rhythm, its own unspoken signal system. Camilla was moving toward the door that led back to the interior corridor. She paused. Through the glass, she could see Charlotte in the garden. The girl was crouched down now, examining something on the path, a stone, a leaf, something small enough to require that full crouch with her elbows on her knees and her face very close to the ground. The green dress was going to need attention. The shoes had taken on a third category of damage that was probably mud adjacent. Camilla watched for a moment. Her face, in that moment, was unguarded in the way that faces become when people believe no one is looking at them. There was something in it that was not sadness exactly, but was adjacent to sadness, the cousin of sadness that lives in the particular experience of watching from a distance something you are not entirely part of. She had been in that family long enough to understand all the things she was and was not. She knew the mathematics of it. She had accepted the mathematics of it with the pragmatic intelligence that had always been one of her defining qualities. It did not mean the mathematics felt comfortable all the time. She turned from the glass and continued into the corridor. Whitmore had seen this, the pause, the watching, the turn. He had positioned himself near the garden doors, and, from his angle he had a clear line of sight both to Charlotte in the garden and to the interior, and he had watched the whole small moment unfold. He did not know what to do with it. This was the part of the job that the protocols did not cover, the part that sat with you later, not as professional concern but as something more human than that. He was watching the weight of a complicated story play out in small moments, a pause at a glass door, a woman watching a child who could not see her, a turn away that was neither defeat nor indifference but something harder to name than either. He was watching, in 4 seconds, the accumulated consequence of years of things that had happened before anyone in that garden was who they were now. He was also watching Charlotte discover whatever was on the path. She had picked it up, definitely a stone, and was examining it with the gravity of a geologist who has found something that may or may not change what they know about the Earth. She turned it over in her fingers. She held it up toward the gray sky to look at it against the light. She put it in her pocket. Whitmore allowed himself this. Allowed himself the awareness that the morning had been a series of small, unrecorded moments, a step taken in a corridor, a man on a horse with an expression Charlotte had found wanting, a parrot whose moral situation had been interrupted at a critical juncture, a stone that had apparently cleared a bar that most stones did not clear. The official record of the day would say that the family attended a luncheon. The photographs, if any existed, would show people in correct clothes in correct arrangements. The palace press office would note nothing, because nothing had occurred. And, in that gap between what the official record contained and what had actually happened, a full and complicated day had lived. The kind of day that was most of what a life actually was, not the events, but the spaces between events, the 4-second moments, the small calibrations, the pauses at glass doors, the pockets that now held stones. Charlotte came back inside 20 minutes later with the certainty of someone who has gotten everything they needed from a garden. She was slightly pink and her third shoe category of damage had confirmed itself as mud, and she handed the stone to her protection officer without any explanation, apparently considering this a reasonable thing to do with a stone you have decided to keep. Whitmore took it. "Good one?" he asked. "It has a white line through it," she said, as though this explained everything. "It does," he agreed. She went back to her father, who was finishing a conversation near the fireplace. Whitmore looked down at the stone in his hand. It was small and gray with a thin white quartz line running diagonally across its surface. He put it in his jacket pocket. The palace was beginning its afternoon. The luncheon had ended. Staff were moving through the receiving rooms with the quiet efficiency of a tide coming back in, restoring order, returning things to the configuration they lived in when the institution was not performing one of its ceremonies. The chairs were going back. The flowers were being reconsidered. The afternoon light, what there was of it through the February clouds, moved slowly across the stone floors. James Whitmore remained where he needed to be. He thought about the day. About what had happened and what had not happened and what the difference between those two things meant. He thought about what it meant to do this job well, not just the physical part, not just the positioning and the sight lines and the knowledge of entry points, but the other part, the part that required him to understand the invisible architecture of human relationships and to move within it with the kind of intelligence that didn't announce itself. The kind that just worked. He thought about Charlotte in the garden. Charlotte with her stone. Charlotte who had gone through her morning completely unbothered by any of the things that had quietly surrounded it, which was precisely what everyone had worked, in their different ways, to ensure. She was 7. She was meant to be 7. There would be more days. More luncheons. More mornings with complicated geometries that needed to be navigated. The dynamics of this family would continue to shift and resettle the way they always had, and there would be new moments that required reading and new situations that required the particular quiet intelligence of a step taken at the right time in the right direction. He would be there for those moments. He would do his job. But today was done. The stone was in his pocket. The horse painting was still on the wall in the east wing with its permanently dissatisfied expression. Somewhere in the sitting room, a book was lying face down on a side table, open to a page where a parrot's situation remained unresolved. Everything that needed to be okay was okay. The flags over the palace were still straight. The gray sky had committed entirely to gray now, the earlier pale blue long gone, but gray here was not failure, it was just weather. The reliable weather of a London February that did not perform, did not promise, simply was what it was and let you dress for it. James Whitmore was dressed for it. He had been dressed for it all along.